Thanks to Surfshark for sponsoring this video. Find out more later on. Hey, 42 here. If you visit Milton Cemetery in Portsmouth, England, you'll find a grave of a man named Alexander Wilson. You'll know it's his because the gravestone will read, "He loved not wisely, but too well." These words from Shakespeare's Othello were chosen by Wilson's children, and they seem to describe a bloke with poor judgment, but a generous heart. And, I have to say, it was a rather fitting quote. Because Alexander Wilson certainly had plenty of love to give. By the time he died, he'd worked his way through 4 different wives, with whom he'd produced 7 children. But what that gravestone in Portsmouth won't tell you is that Wilson had all 4 of those wives at the same time, and that somehow none of them knew about each other until after he died. This, then, is the story of a man who played many roles. He was a soldier, and very probably a British spy. He was a best-selling novelist. He was also a committed family man. So committed, in fact, that he had 4 families in 4 different lives, that he lived completely separately from one another. It's the story of how he managed to get away with a lifetime of deception until he died at the age of 69. And of how the house of cards he'd so carefully built came tumbling down. But that's the end of our tale. Let's start at the beginning. If you love traveling, then you'll love the fastest and easiest VPN, Surfshark. Did you know Surfshark helps you to avoid price discrimination based on your location? So you can actually save money on plane tickets and car rentals whilst traveling. And Surfshark runs on any device, anywhere, and it's packed full of features such as industry-leading uncrackable encryption, IP and DNS leak protection, an internet kill switch if your VPN drops out, and 24/7 customer support. Basically, by using Surfshark, you can stay anonymous and secure online. But personally, I use Surfshark to watch Netflix content from other countries, such as the US, that's usually blocked here in the UK. It's really easy. All I have to do is switch my location settings, and now I have it. Access to all my favorite programs. Surfshark maintains a strict no-logs policy, and their network of 3,200 servers in over 65 countries runs completely on RAM. So they couldn't log your data even if they wanted to. By using the code 42, you'll benefit from an 83% discount plus 3 extra months for free. All you have to do is click the special link in the description below. Don't miss out. Alexander Wilson was born in Dover, England on the 24th of October 1893. His father was a career military man, so Alexander and his family followed him to postings in far-flung corners of the British Empire, like Mauritius, Ceylon, Hong Kong and Singapore. Young Alexander had an excellent education at Catholic schools in Hong Kong and Plymouth, though he was obviously absent the day they taught the 10 Commandments, or maybe he was just out of the room when the teacher got to, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." At the age of 21, Wilson enlisted with the Royal Naval Air Service to serve in World War I. But he was honourably discharged in 1917 thanks to disabling injuries from shrapnel. It was around this time that he married his first wife, Gladys Kellaway, who he would go on to have 3 children with, Adrian, Dennis and Daphne. After being recognised for his bravery in the war, Wilson tried to re-enlist, but he was denied on medical grounds. So he joined the Merchant Navy instead. But after a voyage from London to Vancouver, he was arrested for theft and sentenced to 6 months hard labour in British Columbia. In less than a year, he'd gone from war hero to thief, one of the many contradictions of Wilson's life. Also, not the last time he would be accused of having sticky fingers. After doing his time in Canada, Wilson appeared to turn over a new leaf and went on to manage a touring theatre company with Gladys from 1920 to 1925. He would go on to use his experience as inspiration for his tale, The Magnificent Hobo, published in 1935, the first of many autobiographical events to resurface when Wilson became a professional author later in life. But even at this stage in his career, the man already had a knack for spinning a good yarn. In 1925, some creative writing on his CV landed him a position as a professor of English literature at the University of Punjab in modern-day Pakistan. So Wilson soon set sail for British India to take up his new academic post, leaving his wife and children at the bottom of the gangplank. But he wouldn't be lonely for long. On that same voyage to the east, the soldier turned sailor turned convict, turned theatre director, turned English professor, met Dorothy Phyllis Wick, a British actress who would become his second wife. The pair married 3 years later in a public ceremony at the Cathedral of Lahore. That's a place, by the way, not the French way of saying the prostitute. Even though no official wedding certificate has ever been located, whatever document did exist would have been as empty and meaningless as, well, sex with Lahore, because Wilson was still legally married to poor old Gladys when he tied the knot for the second time. During his time on the subcontinent, Wilson was a busy man. He published his second book, The Devil's Cocktail, learned Urdu and Persian, and became principal of Islamia College. Some biographers, though, believe Wilson's position was actually just a cover for his real work as an informant and recruiter for British intelligence. Wilson's book, for example, was an espionage thriller set in Lahore, describing the struggle between British and Russian intelligence. It features an all-Muslim college and a character remarkably similar to Wilson's boss, Abdullah Yusuf Ali. As with everything else, it's hard to know where Wilson's real life ended and the stories began. After resigning from the college in 1931, Wilson spent the next few years as the editor of a local newspaper. Or at least that's what he claimed. It's also thought that he spent a fair bit of time travelling around Asia and the Middle East during this period, particularly in Ceylon, Palestine, and Arabia. What he was doing in those countries, no one knows for sure. But it's the kind of behaviour that would have made sense if Wilson was indeed a spy. The region was rather unsettled at the time. Pro-independence movements and political mayhem meant there were plenty of terrorist activities, assassinations, and high-profile events to keep an intelligence officer busy. In 1933, wife number 2, Dorothy, returned to England to give birth to Michael, her and Wilson's first child. Well, their first child together. Little did Dorothy know that her husband was already a father 3 times over at this point. Wilson followed them to London soon after, but it wasn't long before he left Dorothy and baby Michael to return to wife number 1, Gladys, and their 3 children, who were now living in Southampton. He stayed with them for 18 months before moving back in with Dorothy and Michael. Now, if you're wondering how the hell Wilson explained all these long absences to his wives and children, it seems they also believed he was involved in espionage of some sort. A mysterious job you aren't allowed to talk about that involves a lot of travel is pretty much the ideal cover story for anyone who fancies having a go at polygamy. But while spying was a great excuse to spend time with whichever wife he chose, it seems Wilson's job was rather less well suited to paying the bills. Providing for a family can be costly. Providing for 2 is downright expensive. The income Wilson made as an author and probable spy wasn't bad, but it wasn't enough to support both of his families simultaneously. After filing for bankruptcy, he was forced to relocate to Yorkshire, and he took Dorothy and Michael with him. It probably wasn't the flat-capped whippets or fine pork pies, but something didn't quite work out for Wilson in Yorkshire, and he left shortly afterwards, in 1941, saying a final farewell to his young son Michael. A year later, at the tender age of 9, the poor boy would be told by an uncle that his father had been killed at the Battle of El Alamein in Egypt. This was another fine pork pie. Wilson was alive and well. But despite the cruel deceit, Michael, like the rest of his siblings, would always remember his father as a loving figure. In retrospect, it's obvious that Wilson's real reason for leaving Yorkshire was, you guessed it, another future Mrs. Wilson, a woman by the name of Alison Mary McKelvey. In 1939, Wilson had started work as a translator for MI6, where he took over a department running surveillance on foreign embassies in London. Alison was almost 30 years younger than Wilson, but he won her over all the same, partly with the help of some forged divorce papers. After Alison's apartment was rendered unlivable by a German bombing raid, the two lovebirds moved in together, and in 1941, the same year he walked out on Dorothy and Michael in Yorkshire, Alison McKelvey became Mrs. Wilson III. As well as ink in his pen, the prolific author clearly had plenty of lead in his pencil, because 2 more sons followed shortly after his latest wedding, Gordon and Nigel, becoming Wilson children numbers 5 and 6. According to redacted reports, in 1942, Wilson was fired from his job as a translator for apparently exaggerating the contents of intercepted phone calls. But for once, it may have been Wilson who was on the receiving end of a cunning deception. The person investigating his translations was a man by the name of Alex Keller, who was later found to have been working for Anthony Blunt, an infamous KGB mole who'd infiltrated the British intelligence service. Some have suggested that Blunt targeted Wilson in an attempt to tarnish the reputation of MI6, British Foreign Intelligence. Whatever the reason for Wilson's dismissal, the British government was so annoyed with his antics that they made an effort to stop him from getting any other kind of worthwhile employment. As a result, his publishing career was effectively over, leaving him and his families, penniless. But Wilson wasn't the type of man to let something so insignificant as reality get him down. He told Alison he was being sent undercover and that all the bad luck that seemed to have befallen them, the money troubles and job losses, was actually just part of his elaborate cover story. If Alison believed this, then she must have been especially convinced when Wilson was declared bankrupt for a second time and jailed for petty theft, also for a second time. On his release, Wilson took a job at Hampstead Cinema, but soon found himself behind bars once again for stealing. He claimed the whole event had been staged so that he could keep tabs on fascist groups in Brixton Prison, making him one of those incredibly rare prisoners who claims to be innocent. From afar, it seems Wilson's life was falling apart, but he obviously managed to retain his charm. In the 1950s, he was trying out another new career, this time as a hospital porter, when, surprise, surprise, he met the woman who would become his 4th and final wife, a nurse called Elizabeth Hill. The pair tied the knot in 1955, and Wilson, now 63, fathered yet another son, Douglas, who was born in the same year. Wilson would later use a fictional job at the Foreign Office as an excuse to stay in London when Elizabeth and Douglas moved to Scotland in 1957. In reality, he was working in the slightly less glamorous role of a clerk in a wallpaper factory. Still, a free man once more, Wilson took the opportunity to move back in with Mrs. Wilson number 3. In case you're struggling to keep up, that was Alison, and their sons Gordon and Nigel. This was Wilson's final move, and he lived out his twilight years in Ealing, West London. On the 4th of April 1963, it was, ironically, Wilson's heart that finally gave out. Clearly exhausted from a lifetime, well, 4 lifetimes, of loving too well. Remarkably, Wilson's multiple marriages were only discovered after he died. Sifting through his personal papers, Alison Wilson found out about Gladys, wife number 1, and contacted her to give her the news and tell her about Wilson's other family. Alison would never find out about Dorothy and Elizabeth, the other 2 wives, but those details eventually surfaced in later years. Wilson had managed to keep his lives so thoroughly separate that some of his children didn't even learn of each other's existence for close to 50 years after his death. In the end, the story of Wilson's life was as full of complicated plots, twists and turns as one of his spy novels. And just like in those novels, the hero at the center of the tale got away with it all. Thanks for watching.